In modern times, the holiday known worldwide as Christmas is regarded as a time to get together with friends and family, engorge oneself with good food, and buy a bunch of expensive presents for that same group of friends and family. Also, Jesus is involved, as it's apparently his literal birthday, and not just a convenient feast day stolen from various pagan traditions in the years before religious tolerance was a thing. It's that literal birth that interests me the most. See, attached to this holiday in the age of mass visual media is a preponderance of kid-friendly retellings of this story, which always seems to cut out unfriendly details like the idea that Mary and Joseph are fleeing from Herod, or the idea that this cute little baby is going to grow up to die horribly and shamefully on a piece of wood outside Jerusalem. From mere cultural osmosis and my years of spirited indoctrination at Catholic school, I can tell you that Mary gets pregnant without having had sex after consenting to bearing God's son. They go to Bethlehem for the census. A giant glowing star marking that location may or may not be involved. Mary is going into labor, and an innkeeper lets them use the stable, given that everywhere else is full. She gives birth then and there, wrapping the baby Jesus up and putting him in a manger filled with straw. The animals are quite interested and feature prominently in most nativity compositions. 3 wise men give the baby king gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, having followed the giant glowing star to this location previously. Some shepherds do the same, but aren't all that important. The story usually ends right here, given that fleeing to Egypt isn't exactly warm and comfy. That's all well and good, but before we check that answer, let's go over a couple of interesting additions that pop culture has stuck onto this story. The most prominent producer of holiday specials has to be Rankin Bass, who put out a plethora of well-known, albeit somewhat secular stop-motion television specials, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, and A Year Without a Santa Claus. These movies were way weirder than you remember.
And shoots jelly.
2 of them were about the birth of Jesus Christ himself, and both followed characters relatively extraneous to the actual story at hand. These are Nestor, the long-eared Christmas donkey, and the little drummer boy. Both of the title characters of these movies are people who experience miserable lives.
What's going on out there? Father! You must run, my son. Escape! Run!
They burned the farm and took the sheep, and Aaron's happy life had changed forever. And so Aaron roamed the land, a lonely orphan. His only friends, 3 of the farm animals who had escaped. He vowed to hate all humans for what they had done to his family, and he kept that vow.
The good Lord sometimes works in strange ways. The love of Nestor's mother had saved him. But in saving Nestor, she had allowed the storm to take her, and she was gone forever.
Nestor.
And now, Nestor was all alone.
Right up until they cross paths with Jesus or his family, both are similarly pushed by fate towards the nativity scene, which resolves their internal or external struggles. The drummer boy plays for the baby Jesus and gets his sheep friend and general misanthropy healed by the power of Christ. Nestor helps Mary and Joseph get to Bethlehem, and he returns home afterwards to our hero's welcome. This is in spite of the obvious question: how did they know what happened? Did they read the script? Which brings us to the ostensible script for this story, the biblical version. For this, I will be using the New Oxford Annotated Bible. While Mark and John don't start with the birth of Jesus, Matthew and Luke do. In Matthew, we start with an extraordinarily pointless genealogy of Joseph, husband of Mary, who is not the father of Jesus, the protagonist of the Gospels. It's mostly there to bolster the argument that Jesus is the one who was foretold. That over and done with, the most preamble we get to the birth of Jesus is Joseph's trepidation over Mary becoming suspiciously pregnant, and the angel telling him that's all cool. Anything to do with Herod searching for the child and the wise men doesn't happen until after Jesus is born. That star shows up right as he is born. The wise men are sent by Herod under false pretenses to pay him homage. They give Mary the gifts and are told by the angels to leave, which they do. There's also no journey on the part of Joseph and Mary, as they most likely live in Bethlehem. When Herod realizes he's been played, he murders a bunch of babies 2 years old or younger, but divine intervention meant that Joseph and his family had pieced out to Egypt ahead of time. In Luke, we actually start with Zechariah and Elizabeth, the parents of John the Baptist, who are old and barren, but are granted a child by divine intervention. Most of this isn't relevant other than for the role John plays later in the story. After the Immaculate Conception happens, the Roman Emperor Augustus orders the census. Joseph, being a descendant of David, has to go to Bethlehem. There, Mary gives birth in a stable, and some shepherds who had been told to follow the star meet the newborn king. And here comes the final part of the essay, and perhaps the hardest to actually write. C. Distinguishing fact from fiction with regards to Jesus Christ, leaving behind the extremely sticky questions of a metaphysical bent, is extremely difficult. The Gospels are the best record we've got of the life and times of Jesus. What we can tell, according to a brief introduction to the New Testament by Bart Ehrman, is that no grand journey probably happened, or if it did, it wasn't due to a census. C. Sending everybody back to their ancestral home would have been a biblical grade pain in the ass to pull off. The entire goddamned empire would be running all over the place trying to fulfill the edict, and Augustus' administration would have had to prepare to count people at their destinations, which they can't predict in advance. And since there's no other record of Augustus trying something that insane, the more benign explanation is that Jesus' family might have simply lived in Bethlehem when he was born, and then grew up in Nazareth, fusing both Luke and John's take, while removing the journey and lack of in space that makes the king born in a stable scene happen. Emphasis on might given the eternal vagueness of biblical history. In the end, our understanding of how and where Jesus was born might always be vague. But in the end, capitalism means we can never stop trying.
Jesus isn't to me jolly. Not la. Sing like this. Deck the halls with boughs of holly. La 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 la. Try it. Deck the hall with boughs of holly. Ra 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 ra. Jesus is. Sing something else.